Okay, it's 11 o'clock. My name is Golbon Zakeri. I'm a professor at Mechanical and Industrial Engineering Department at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I want to first and foremost thank all of our panelists here for spending the energy and the time and joining us in this very short notice. They are far too eminent for me to do a good job of giving their bios or introduction. Links have been sent to all the attendees. Anyone who does not know you can read about you extensively. Thank you very much to all the attendees for putting the time and joining us. The point of this panel discussion is to explore the issues, the recent issues of the Texas blackout a little bit further, learn what we can from the data and the analysis has been done thus far, discuss some improvements and what the research community, in particular, operations research, energy and natural resources section of Informs folks can take away from this. I have a couple of introductory slides that I would like to share with people just to start the discussion. This is what I've managed to gather together. So as an outline of the Texas market, Electric Reliability Council of Texas, so ERCOT. It's an energy-only market. There is no capacity market. It operates by locational marginal pricing, incorporates operating reserves demand curve that translates into a price adder. And Professor Hogan can explain that far more eloquently and in better detail than I ever can. As I understand it, transmission network connection to the rest of the US is weak. And it's my understanding that because of this, there is no requirement to comply with FERC regulations. And perhaps Dr. O'Neill can pitch in there and tell us a little bit more about it. Generation owners and operators are not required to implement any weatherization standards. As I understand it, the makeup of the generation is roughly 50% natural gas, roughly 30% wind, and then coal, solar, and nuclear in the order that's written on the slide. Residential, commercial, and industrial electricity prices over the last several number of years have been lower in the state of Texas than the average US prices by some 10 to 25%. What I can understand from the blackouts, and these are taken from media, is that it started just after midnight on the 15th of February, lasted for about 3 days. Over 5 million people were affected. They did not have power, some for 3 days. This kind of percolated down to water availability issues that we have heard about. There have been deaths reported owing to hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning. There's an estimated $90 billion in losses from the event. And it's been reported that Texas has spent $50 billion on electricity in 1 week. Another potentially interesting fact is that 90% of Texas was affected, but not areas such as El Paso and Beaumont. So that's my very short, succinct sort of introduction and hoping to get things started. So for the panel, may I ask you to please briefly introduce yourselves? And if we get into the introduction game, we would have 5 hours of introduction very easily. And make any edits that you see fit into my brief introduction to ERCOT and the events. And then kindly let us know if you think that, in your view, the recent events constitute any form of regulatory or market failure. And just before we get started, I'll remind the audience that the chat is disabled, but you are able to write your questions in the Q&A section, which is down at the bottom of the Zoom panel. So I will not speak anymore and ask Shmuel, then Bill, then Richard, Ross, and Ben in that order to please answer the questions. So go ahead, Shmuel, please.
Good morning. I'm speaking to you from beautiful Berkeley, even though I must admit that it's very foggy outside, not like in the picture. So I don't have any inside information other than what I read in the media and what I heard from the presentation by Magnus, the CEO. That's what my opinion is based on. Again, we should distinguish between two aspects of the system operation and the market operation. And as far as the system goes, I mean, everybody has, in hindsight, says, oh, you know, if the system was better weatherized, and we could have avoided a lot of that, which is true. Or if we're interconnected, we already got the answer from Perry to that. The Texans are willing to put up with jurisdiction. So those are kind of hindsights. As far as the operation went, it looks like ERCOT did what it had to do. I mean, they didn't have a cascading failure. In terms of the, you know, so the question, I'm still not sure that people are willing to pay what it would take to completely weatherize the system and insure themselves against this kind of rare events. You know, we have the same situation in California, that ideally we would bury all the transmission line to prevent fires, but nobody is willing to pay for that. So this is one of the questions that people have to address, how much they're willing to pay to insure themselves against this kind of what I refer to as black swans. In the long run, an area that is kind of my pet peeve, that I would see potential improvement, is that instead of rotating outages, we have the technology these days to have some sort of priority curtailment that would leave everybody with a little bit of power, and instead of cutting some people completely. And hopefully in the future, we are going to develop that side of the demand side to enable this kind of mitigation through a little more efficient curtailment procedure. Now, as far as the market goes, I think that the market functioned just fine. It did what it was supposed to do. The prices went to scarcity prices, which was by design. And unfortunately, because of all the other problems, the capability of responding was handicapped. And as a result of that, you start to have persistent pricing at the scarcity level for multiple days, which cause massive wealth transfers. And that's when we need circuit breakers, the same way we have in the stock market, to somehow mitigate that effect. And in fairness to ERCOT does have circuit breakers, which triggered. The circuit breaker is that it's basically the rule, for those of you who are not familiar with that, is that if a generator with a heat rate of 10 is recovering in a year more than 3 times cone, which is the cost of new entry, and that's about $90,000 to $105,000 per megawatt year. If you recover more than 3 times that, then the high cap, which is $9,000, goes down to either $2,000 or 50 times the gas index, whichever is higher. Well, in this case, because the price of gas went from $3 to $3.50, more than 100 times, that circuit breaker didn't quite do what it was supposed to do, because the 50 times that price was more than the $9,000 cap. So there is something to be discussed. As far as the market went, I have little sympathy for people that went on the greedy program and didn't shut down their electricity. Ross and I kind of kidded that probably they were into indoor agriculture or some sort, using electricity and they're not supposed to.
Okay.
Anyway,
just wrap up, please, Shmuel, and then we move on.
Yeah. No, that's it. That's what I had to say.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for that. Bill, may I ask for your contribution, please?
So I'm Bill Hogan from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I won't repeat all the things that Shmuel said, which I agree with. I think, of course, this was a terrible situation, and it is something that is going to have to be studied very carefully in the post-mortem, and what to do going forward depends on some things that will be known, but I don't know at the moment. So we have to kind of figure these things out. I'm most worried about people jumping to conclusions and which are the wrong conclusions, and then not trying to help things going forward. And I would want to emphasize that a couple of points. One is I think that the ERCOT managers of the system, they were stuck with the problem of crisis management. And although they've been under attack for what they did, I think they did exactly what they were supposed to do under the circumstances once it started. And we should recognize that they saved us from having something that was much, much worse. So that's an important observation. Second is that a critical issue here is the scale and the scope of what went on. So I think this was unprecedented. I've heard various claims. We'll see how this sorts out. But at the time, people were saying this is a 1 in 100-year weather event. And this compares with the planning standard in other parts of the country, which is the one event in 10 years. So this is supposedly much rarer. And secondly, is that it was bigger because it lasted so long and it covered so much territory. So you had something which is doubly unprecedented, and that is a very serious problem. And I think we should be careful about judging too quickly what went wrong. I think I'm happy to talk about it. I don't think this is a problem of renewables. I don't think it's a failure of the market design. I don't even think it's a failure of regulation necessarily, given the scope and the scale of what we had. And I think the Texas market has the essence of what is going to be needed going forward. So we don't want to destroy something that actually is going to deal with problems like increased intermittency. The idea to leave you with is you can't insure against everything. You do the best that you can, and then you have an envelope of operations. And when you get outside the envelope, then you go into crisis management, which is what we had. And we were clearly outside the envelope here. And I don't think we're prepared to insure against everything. And I think that's slowly dawning on the folks in Texas. I'll leave you with a quote which captures the essence of the problem as I see it. This was very early on while it was going on, and it was an interview with the mayor of Oklahoma City on PBS right in the middle of the crisis. And of course, they were having problems in Oklahoma, but the mayor is not in. So
we lost.
This is the mayor of Oklahoma City. Somebody muted me. And the mayor is not in Texas, obviously, in Oklahoma City. And what he said on PBS, this is David Holt, is, I'll read you the quote, where we're probably not going to build a city that is ready to have sub-zero temperatures for a week every year. That would be too expensive. Our taxpayers wouldn't want to do that. And that's a very brave, I believe, under the circumstances and given the politics statement, but I think it captures what may turn out to be the long run essence of this problem. This was way outside the envelope, and I don't know any system that would have prevented it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's move on to Richard, please.
You are muted.
Richard, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. First, to answer Golbon's question, there's a long history of Texas independence and specifically its grid. It goes back into the 70s, and it involves sort of a legendary person in Texas folklore. Ross may have heard of him because the Texas Utilities General Counsel, whose name was Tiny Gooch, or his nickname was Tiny. He was about 6'7". He was a three-sport athlete at the University of Texas. And the rumor has it, or the legend has it, that he was, excuse me for a second. Legend has it that that he went out to cut the wires when one of the Texas utilities actually did connect to the interstate grid. And the rest sort of is, there's a sort of a gory history, and there's a long set of rules and regulations about how FERC deals with Texas. We do have FERC, I'm sorry, I apologize. I left FERC a year or so ago, and now at ARPA-e. The FERC essentially regulates them from the reliability aspects, and but leaves their market alone. First of all, I wanted to say there was no collusion in my remarks, Shmuel's remarks, or Bill, but you'll find a common theme. I won't try to decompose the events or to point big figures. Sorry about that. But I want to make three suggestions for the future. First, most auction markets have both emergency circuit breaker or circuit breaker rules that are different from normal operations. Those two sets of operations should have clear distinctions. In my opinion, once forced curtailments start, the market is no longer functioning, and it's not clear exactly what the rules should be, but it doesn't seem to me that once you're into forced curtailments that you would continue with normal market pricing or function. Second, when you have this distinction, first of all, I would try to minimize the interventions into the normal market operations and work to minimize emergency operations. Third, I would implement a bid-in demand program where at least the large users have comparable participation models to generate. That way, there would be a much better way of responding to these prices as opposed to the current approach, which is mostly ex post. I think that this type of a program would produce enough profits to sustain the market over the long haul. And the demand side participation by bidding in would be win-win-win, even to prevent emergency operations. And this is probably, in my opinion, going to be necessary for the future of higher renewable penetration. And I would just close with my remark that the first century of power systems generation followed load, and the second century load will need to follow generation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dave. Move on to Ross, please. Ross, could you please unmute yourself and share your views with us?
Sure. Thanks, Golbon. My name is Ross Baldick. I'm an emeritus professor in electrical and computer engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. I have a few potted comments. I think I concur with the general observations that ERCOT did exactly what it needed to do during the crisis. There is some evidence that they might have been a little bit better at forewarning people in advance but I think during the crisis they did exactly what they should have. Golbon, you have some numbers. I hadn't heard an insurance up at 90 billion. I'd heard 15 billion. I think we'd have to understand whether that was all electricity related or perhaps water related as well. But the thing I do specifically want to comment on in your thing is you indicated market transfers that were pretty large, but that I assume is based on something like multiplying the energy times the prices, the real-time prices. We should all be aware that most energy in most markets transacts forward, and therefore only a small fraction of the energy is transacted at that very high price. So I think that estimate is not a credible estimate of what the market transfers were at the time.
Thank you. That's a very good point.
I think Bill makes a good point that we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Clearly, from the outset, for example, Governor Abbott jumped to conclusions that were not credible. And I think instead we need to do some forensics to understand what really happened. I mean, obviously it was extreme weather that led to outage levels that were far higher than any event we'd experienced in the past, whether that's cold or hot. And I also want to mention that it was outages in water supplies, in electric and gas. And I want to return to the gas issue. Generally speaking, ERCOT's prepared for the range of extreme of weather that we experience, which is pretty wide. In other words, prepared for quite hot weather. So translating that into you northern state people, extreme hot weather, and prepared for cold weather. Translating that into you northern types, pretty cold weather. But we're not prepared for extreme hot by Texas standards. So it has never gone to, let's say, 120 degrees across the whole of Texas, but it's gone well above 100 and above 105, and we've coped with that fine. And it's gone freezing before in Texas. But even compared to the 2011 events in, for example, I saw some statistics with Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. It was 10 Fahrenheit degrees in this event lower at its minimum than the minimum back in 2011, which was the last really cold event, and it lasted for a lot longer. So it was, as Bill absolutely said, it was an extreme event, and perhaps we shouldn't plan to insure for events that are sufficiently rare. Now, having said that, in the last 10 years, to the best of my knowledge, it snowed twice in Austin. Once occurred 2 weeks ago, and the previous time occurred on January the 10th. Some of the people in the audience might notice that on January the 10th, it also snowed in Madrid. And in fact, that was apparently due to a jet stream effect that brought the cold down across not only North America, but also Northern Europe. The 2 weeks ago event was probably a jet stream, brought it down across North America. I think we might need to change our expectations about how often these events, I'm not a weather expert, I'm not a climate expert, but just anecdotally, what we used to think of as extreme may not be an appropriate definition going forward. What that means for us could be kind of scary, but having said that, I don't think we have a clear cost on what the weatherization that has been discussed in lots of forums would cost, how it would compare to $90 billion of insurance losses. We also don't know whether recommendations back in 2011, which was the last major cold event, the one I alluded to that wasn't quite as cold as this one, there were recommendations, they weren't mandatory. We actually don't know, and this is another reason for forensics, whether the generators carried out none of them, some of them, or all of them. And we don't know whether the failures in 2011 for those generators was the same as 2021. In other words, we don't know the basic parameters about what it would have cost to prevent what happened. And so I think we need to think about that really carefully, do some forensics, understand that. And we also need to understand one more issue that relates to the circuit breakers. We have divided gas and electric regulation in Texas, and Shmuel alluded to this, so that if you have a circuit breaker on the market and suspend market operations in electricity, unless you can do that in gas as well, I think we would have had maybe not very different problem. I'd like to disagree a little bit with Dick. I think while the market was operating, and even if we had only a couple of gigawatts of rotating curtailment, 2 or 3 gigawatts, let's say, and we've had that in the past, we could easily imagine the market continuing. The price would be at value of lost load. Market participants who hedged would not be exposed to that. Market participants at the margin who were being supplied with electricity would have a strong incentive either to increase generation or decrease consumption. That works, I think, up to a gigawatt or 2 of rotating outages. But of course, we had a much bigger amount of outage, curtailments for a much longer time. So I think we should have had some sort of circuit breaker or suspension of markets. But I need to emphasize that that may need us to think very carefully about our divided regulation of gas and electric in Texas, because without a similar suspension on the gas market, it's not clear that, let's say, a move to a cost-based transfers, when the gas guys were pricing their gas at $9,000 a megawatt hour divided by marginal heat rate of peakers. Right? So we need to think about the implications of those circuit breakers. And I think that's the main things I have to say.
Thank you very much, Ross. Okay, moving on to Ben, please.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me? Okay, I'm Ben Hobbs. I'm a professor in Johns Hopkins, and I also chair the Market Surveillance Committee of the California ISO, but these are just my opinions. So of course, in California, we had a little bit of extreme weather last August, set world records for temperatures of 130 degrees, lost a lot of capacity. Some in smaller magnitude, but some not dissimilar stresses to the system that Texas just experienced. So what I'd like to address, especially to the students who are out there, is how us as operations researchers can help in this situation. I mean, I've got my pet solutions. I do like capacity markets, not all capacity markets, but I think there's a role they can provide at least one suspender, maybe not 2 suspenders for our belt, but 1 suspender enough to help keep the pants at least from falling down to our ankles. But I think we'll get a chance to talk about that later. So there are 3 areas of OR at least that can help out, and I encourage the students to take a look at. One is decision analysis and behavioral decision making. So Kamen and Tversky told us that we chronically underestimate tail risks. That's just a cognitive limitation, or in plain Anglo-Saxon, stupidity. Okay, there are also motivational biases. So stupidity and folly lead to markets failing, and markets can fail to adequately prepare us. And so to answer Golbon's question, yes, there were market failures. So there's a role for regulation, and I think capacity markets with not only performance standards and penalties, but also some requirements for example, backup or dual fuel supply and weatherization makes some sense. It wouldn't have solved this problem, wouldn't have prevented this problem, but it would have made it less severe. And we have to remind ourselves that there's also government failure, that capacity markets can be badly designed. That's one of the reasons why California had its problems in August. We had belt and suspenders, but the suspenders were 40 years old. They were for grandfathers or grandmothers' pants, and they didn't hold things up. We need to give the old way of calculating system reliability a gold watch and retire it, and we need to think about infrastructure interdependence, water, gas, and electricity. And we also need to think about highly correlated common mode outages. Okay, so one of them was decision analysis, behavioral decision making. Second, risk analysis, and I thank Ross, an exchange between Ross and Rodrigo Moreno on this. But basically, you need to characterize risks, and it's not just statistics. We're in a non-stationary system with deep uncertainty about the climate. Thank you, Ross, for pointing that out. But we also need better short-run probabilistic forecast methods. I've heard ERCOT's forecasting methods being blamed for underestimating the risks. I don't know that that's the case, but it certainly should be looked at. Second thing that risk analysis does is balance risks between, how does that Oklahoma City mayor, it's a mix of financial instruments, physical preparedness to reduce vulnerability and harden the system, and then resilience, emergency response, increase the ability to bounce back. And the right mix of that is going to take a lot of careful analysis. Third, you need to think about the system, common mode and correlated failures, and also system effects, such that the lack of electricity means that gas pipelines can't keep things warm and they freeze up. And the lack of gas means you have less electricity. So, and furthermore, of course, the water impacts. And I encourage you all to read Jim Bushnell's recent blog on this. It's terrific. Okay, so decision analysis, risk analysis, and finally, of course, optimization, which everybody on this page, I think, on this panel just absolutely dearly love. Optimization, stochastic optimization, to identify perhaps some system level solutions accounting for these interactions. Second thing that optimization can do is identify, supporting prices for attractive solutions. Hopefully without picking technologies, emphasizing performance so you have a level playing field. So if there are new solutions for the problems, they can earn money as well. And these incentives have to recognize the stupidity and folly of individual decision makers. The cognitive and motivational limitations. Market simulations using optimization methods can, for example, assess how badly would the California resource adequacy system perform given the way that it calculates and miscalculates capacity credits. How far short of the ideal? And then you can use these methods to answer questions like, what would be the benefit of a capacity market that requires dual fuel capability and weatherization standards? How would it perform in this circumstance? I should note that NERC and FERC do not have performance standards for generation resource assets. This would be controversial, but I think that we need this.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Ben, especially the eloquent similes. I really enjoyed those. So there have been a bunch of questions in the Q&A. They kind of fit into 2 or 3 different themes. So let me kind of rephrase some of these questions put together and ask the first one, which addresses winterization. So people are asking, is it really onerous to do winterization? How come other countries and other states who are not perceived as affluent as a first world country like the US are able to do this? And there's some examples provided. Is it not the case that the American taxpayer would be able to basically afford this, and should it be regulated? So can I just have very short addressing of this specific question regarding weatherization and whether or not we should have regulation, enforcement, or somehow incentivization to do so for the generators? I think the whole panel agrees that that had not been carried out. So Shmuel first.
Well, as again, it's not clear that people, are in Texas, people are independently minded. And I advised the PUCT there for about 9 years. And the general sentiment is that people should be treated as adults and insure themselves. And you cannot have mandatory insurance. This goes back to essentially to the capacity market. Capacity market is nothing more than a centralized hedge against the spot prices. And, people don't like mandatory provision in Obamacare. They don't like capacity market in Texas. And the question, especially since Texas has been driven primarily by customer choice, and so you have to let customer do their choice. And you have 60 independent retail providers that they feel that they are in the business of hedging, Unfortunately, some of them use bankruptcy as a hedge, but and then they suffer the consequences. But in general, I think that they choose to relegate the hedging function to private companies rather than institute the centralized hedging mechanism, which is the capacity market. The capacity market is nothing more than call options with a strike price of $1,000 a megawatt hour. And if some people like that and some people don't like it. And in Texas, they opted not to like it. I think that the idea of scarcity pricing were just fine. I think, and I don't agree with Dick, that you should suspend the scarcity pricing as soon as you have some curtailments. I think the problem is the temporal correlation, that when the scarcity prices persist for 5 days, now those are no longer independent spikes. And that's when you need so it's the temporal correlation that requires some sort of circuit breaker to stop the bleeding. But other than that, I think the market initially at least worked just fine.
Okay, great, thank you. Bill, your comments regarding weatherization, and if you like to address some of the differences between capacity market design as well as the energy only or utilizing this ORDC and price adder, I would be grateful for that as well. My personal reaction, and please correct this if it's wrong, was that there is less risk involved when the generators are paid upfront for providing capacity, rather than having to collect payment from scarcity pricing or very high prices. And that may entice more investment into capacity and reserve. So please address those.
So on the weatherization question, this is partly a factual question. I don't know the answer exactly, but I don't think we should assume it's cheap. I think if you decide to design your system in advance to be weatherized, it affects things like how deep do you bury the pipelines, and then you do it, and then you're weatherized in the future. But if you don't do it and then you come back, you're talking about something that could be quite expensive to try to fix that part of the problem. And there's a lot of other dimensions to it. So I think I'm pretty sure that some of the weatherization took place after 2011. So I don't think zero is accurate, but on whether or not there was enough and how much it costs and all that trade-off is something we have to decide. As to the debate between the scarcity pricing and capacity markets, I have been saying for a very long time this is a false dichotomy. If you don't have a capacity market, you need scarcity pricing. And if you do have a capacity market, you need scarcity pricing. So do the scarcity pricing. And one of the big problems in the capacity markets that we've been trying to fix is you pay for the capacity up front and then it doesn't show up when you need it. Then you have to have penalty schemes in real time in order to make sure that you provide the incentive for people to actually show up. So why don't you just do that in the first place with respect to the scarcity pricing design. And then you may conclude that you want to do both. I don't know, you might want to do, that's not illogical necessarily it is illogical to have a capacity market without scarcity pricing. It is not illogical to have scarcity pricing and then introduce a conservative assumption on top of it. And in Texas, the approach, doing more is not the same thing as doing a capacity market. There are other things that you can do. For example, in Texas, they modified the empirical estimates of the loss, the outage probabilities, and increased them to be more conservative in order to have moderate scarcity prices occurring more often. And that was already done over the last couple of years by the Public Utilities Commission. So it's a mistake to say that they haven't done anything in order to deal with this resource adequacy. And then finally, as an alternative to capacity markets, we should look closely at the Australian approach to this problem, which boils down, I won't go through all the details, but it boils down to, with some reasonable anticipation, like a year ahead or so, they do a check to make sure that people have hedges that have been arranged to protect them in case they get into a high pricing scenario. And these hedges become mandatory. Now, these hedges are financial instruments based on delivered prices. They have nothing to do with installed capacity. But the argument is then because people have to sign them, then that'll break pressure in the market so that people will invest in the right kinds of generation. And you won't have the regulator deciding on which generators to invest in. You'll just have the market deciding based on these hedges. And it focuses on the real problem that you actually run into in real time, which is the huge wealth transfer. So I think the Australian model is something that would deserve much closer scrutiny. They also have a circuit breaker. I think the circuit breaker problem is extremely hard when you're dealing with something that's of the scale and the duration that we're talking about. The Public Utilities Commission with Texas was quite clear that they were worried that if they let the circuit breaker operate as planned, that it was going to create a greater disconnect between the gas and the electric market and would make the situation worse. So I think this is a very hard problem to deal with going forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So for Dick, Ross, and Ben, while you're addressing the same questions, could I also add in something that's come up on the Q&A panel? I believe this is from Tongzhen Zhang, who's at the ISO New England. So he asks, should and how will the tail event, such as the one we discussed here, be considered in resource planning or capacity market? So Ben, you mentioned some tools, but if you would like to go deeper into that once the panel arrives at you, I would appreciate that. So could I ask Dick to chip in with winterization, capacity, and scarcity pricing, as well as tail events?
Okay, hear me now? Yeah, the capacity markets have a very checkered history. It was noticed early on that LNP pricing by itself was not going to raise enough revenue in order to sustain new investment. So instead of correcting the problem in the energy markets, they constructed capacity markets. And I agree that you can have both. And the idea, I think, is to make sure that the energy markets are clearing properly. And I personally think that bid and demand essentially gets rid of some of the administrative criticisms that the ORDC receives, and that if you have bid and demand, you're going to have periods of time where the prices are set by the demand curve, which means that all the generators online are making money, and that should generate enough money to make new investments. And when that happens, the natural result is that the price in the capacity market goes arguably to zero or something close to zero. So you can have both, and you essentially take the air out of the capacity markets. So if you think you need the capacity markets, that's fine, but don't lean on the capacity markets to make up for the missing money. Weatherization creates its own problems. It needs a monitoring process. And it's not clear that if you had completely weatherized your generator, that you were going to be able to get gas. Texas is notorious for not winterizing their wellhead market in Texas. And I have no idea whether, how much the pipes froze in the natural gas system. So the weatherization goes literally all the way back to the wellhead. And that creates yet another problem. The Texas Railroad Commission has never been terribly interested in regulating the Texas intrastate market. Interestingly enough, the gas markets were interconnected, the intrastate gas markets were interconnected with the rest of the nation in the Natural Gas Policy Act in '78. That process is working fairly well. And it did solve a lot of problems, certainly not the winterization. And the other comment I'd like to make is on the hedging. It's probably really important to understand and to have the market understand hedges. If you could sell your hedge back to the market, that would give a huge incentive for people who have these hedges to get off the system and essentially get to the market price. If you're simply just, you have a financial hedge or something of that nature, then you may basically consume because you're facing only a specific price and you can't take advantage of the fact that you can sell back. So the hedging contracts are important, but then again, trying to regulate a hedging market is really, really difficult. But it should be possibly an information program to try to get people to sell hedges that make the market work better and not necessarily just simply insulate yourself from the market.
Many
By the
thanks.
way, the interesting thing about the Gritty program is on their website, they were about to announce a summer hedge, not a winter hedge.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, moving on to Ross.
That's very funny. They're not going to do any hedging. I would, first of all, like to observe that in the context of weatherization, we have both summerization and winterization, and they're to some extent antithetical. In the summer, and even in most of the winter in Texas, I wear shorts. I don't wear long pants. Generators up north apparently are more often built in enclosures, but the practice generally in Texas, not universally, the University of Texas generator is fully enclosed. The practice in Texas is to not enclose them to allow them to get rid of heat in the summer. So following up on Bill's point about retrofitting can be expensive, I think that's true, but it's also an issue that coping with very cold temperatures is antithetical potentially to some degree to coping with very hot temperatures. And generally speaking, Texas generators have been very well prepared for hot temperatures. So we need to think a little bit about that, although I will return to the issue about weatherization in a moment. I think the capacity markets versus energy only markets issue is a red herring in the event that happened 2 weeks ago. The estimated demand at the peak, meaning what it would have been had there not been curtailment, was about 6 gigawatts higher than the previous winter peak. Incidentally, that previous winter peak occurred the Sunday evening just before the curtailments. And that winter peak was itself multiple gigawatts higher than what a previous normal winter peak had been. The capacity market would not have prepared for 10 gigawatts more than what the historical expectations had been. So I just don't, I think that's been a red herring as far as I can see in the discussion. It might have, capacity market might well have arranged for a couple of gigawatts more, but we had on the order of 40 gigawatts of outages. And some of that outage was certainly the thermal generators failing, but it appears that, and I think this was Shmuel's point, it was also, I think, Dick's point, the freezing of gas pipes and gas infrastructure was a big contributor. So we do need to think about multiple infrastructures when we're talking about weatherization. We can't just ready, fire, aim. We need to think about what is possible, to return to Bill's point. There are things that are undoubtedly just not possible in a retrofit context, and there are other things that presumably are. To Bill's point, they might be quite expensive. Shmuel had, I think, a good argument about a preference for private insurance in Texas, but I would observe that it depends on there being rational expectations about the probability of this kind of event, and that the resulting market prices internalize the costs into the market. So everybody so far has been keen on circuit breakers. The circuit breakers, by definition, will avoid internalization of that market price into the market. So I think we have to face the fact that we do not have a mechanism for hedging within the market for such events. And so furthermore, I think society likely, Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Governor Abbott aside, society might have risk preferences for the outcomes of tail events that are really different from market participants. And to me, this is a strong argument for considering mandatory weatherization, by which I mean thinking about the costs, coming to some agreement about what we're prepared to tolerate, a once in 10-year, once in 50-year storm, and making a decision outside the functioning of the market. And to be clear here, I have a strong preference for letting the market work, but I think if we're going to expect that circuit breakers are going to prevent market prices occurring during 4 out of the 5 or 5 out of the 5 days, we can't pretend to talk about the market internalizing those effects. But as Dick mentions, this is a regulatory issue. People have complained about the Public Utility Commission not being, not taking a strong enough role. But the Railroad Commission, which regulates gas and oil, makes the PUC look positively laissez-faire, right? But the opposite, makes them look like a very strong regulator. They're very laissez-faire. We'll need to, if we're going to think about weatherization and mandatory weatherization, it has to be across multiple infrastructures, and we're going to have to think about changing our regulatory structure. There has already been a bill tabled in Texas to combine the functions of the Railroad Commission and the PUCT. I don't know whether it has any chance of passing, but that is finally on the table after never having been on the table in any previous legislature, never been taken seriously in the past. So I think there are some changes.
Yep, thank you. And Ben, if you could please maybe take a couple of minutes to address that.
Sure. Before I do, let me thank you, Golbon, for organizing this, and thank my fellow panelists for joining. This has been terrific discussion, and I can't believe the hour has already flown by. In honor of Ross's red herrings, I've donned some red suspenders here. Only one of them is attached because capacity markets aren't a perfect solution, but they're I think, a partial solution. Notice, for example, in New York and the Northeast, I understand that, for example, the gas generators in New York City are required to have dual fuel capability of oil tanks on site, oil tanks that have been scrapped in the last few years, I understand, in ERCOT. Those things, of course, are expensive, and there's an environmental hazard with them. But I think they could have been helpful here, and that's the sort of thing that could be required as part of an RA obligation. Another way that regulation might help, this is an idea of Alison Silverstein's, that perhaps all commercial industrial customers there should be emergency authority that the gas and electricity use could be reduced by 2/3. Preferably this be by a market mechanism like Shmuel's priority pricing, and maybe instituting this sort of rule could pave the way for such a thing. But the difficulty is that many customers could either get electricity or gas, but if your furnace blowers aren't working, having gas come to your house is not very helpful. But if you don't have gas, having electricity come to your house is not very helpful. And again, Jim Bushnell's blog on this point, I think, is very useful. We have such a kludgy demand-side management system that can't get us to the optimal solution of getting some gas and some electricity to everybody, instead of sort of bang, bang. Power plants don't have priority. Residential customers have priority for gas. So they get gas, but they don't get electricity. And regarding Tungshin's question about tails, I absolutely agree with the discussion thus far that it's going to be a risk-benefit analysis. You have to understand what the possible consequences are of extreme events, common mode failures, correlated failures, considering the zipper effect of cascading failures and infrastructure interdependencies. And then you have to think about social preferences and not just private preferences. And those social preferences can lead to regulatory solutions and putting both of the suspenders on.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think there are a lot of questions about climate change and changing weather patterns, and we don't really know what distributions we're going to be facing. So that adds enormously to the complexity there. But that's another topic that we can spend hours talking about. I just have one last question for each of the panel members. Please take 1 minute only to answer this. In the era of energy justice and energy equity, One of the, I think this becomes quite topical. I think we have an attendee, Camilo Gallego Arias. Apologies if I pronounced your name wrong. And this person writes, how is it possible to treat electricity, water, and gas services the same as the stock market in cases of stop loss order? And it kind of goes very much against the grain if you're thinking about people dying of hypothermia because they don't have electricity, and then you're thinking about governing the market through prices. So if you could please touch on that. I know 1 minute is an extremely short amount of time, but I would really appreciate it. So Shmuel again first.
Well, I mean, if you have money, you always have the Cancun option. So, but obviously not everybody can afford it. I mean, I think that's a societal decision of how much we want to, we are now debating whether everybody should have healthcare of some sort. So this is, I think that we have a long way to go in deciding that. It's not just restricted to those, to water, gas, and electricity. I mean, there are other necessities in life that some people are deprived of. I don't have that, living in the Bay Area where you have 10,000 of people sleeping on the street. It's brings it home.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to Bill.
Well, this is, of course, presents important challenges. Partly there's a technology answer that has already been described. So if we had better metering and control mechanisms installed, the sort of smart meter idea, so that you could have a little bit of power available for everybody as opposed to a lot of power available for some and none for others, then that would make a big difference in practice. And then on the second question, the being able to pay for it, this is not a new problem. So the regulators already have procedures for dealing with low-income people, and there are all kinds of transfers. These will get plenty of attention in the days coming ahead. That's, as I say, it's a familiar problem, which cuts across many other areas, but certainly we've already suspended, I believe, in Texas, disconnection policies for the short run, and more things will be coming down the pike as we're trying to deal with this, the impact, particularly on people who basically can't afford it.
Okay, thank you. Dick?
Yeah, I think that, it's really important to separate out the needy from the normal customers, and some advocates want to reduce the prices so that it'll be both cheap to heat your swimming pool in the winter and serve the poor. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you want to heat your swimming pool in the winter, you pay, market prices or whatever, and you find a way to deal with the poor or the people who are needy, that doesn't essentially force you to subsidize people that don't deserve it.
Okay, thank you. Ross?
Well, I think I don't have much to add to the discussion, except to say that I think we need to distinguish the humanitarian crisis moments when people were dying from hypothermia, and more normal times where prices can be going up and down, and all of the mechanisms that are being described to help out low-income people can be enforced. I'd also like to mention that I was on the receiving end of having gas but no electricity, so I sure would have liked a couple of the gritty customers to have dropped their thermostats a little bit and allowed for rolling of my availability of electricity.
Thank you. Ben?
So this is a state that feels strongly about government coming for their guns. And this is also, I imagine that customers will also feel strongly about artificially limiting their consumption, not giving them the right to override. So the sort of metering and fuses that Bill talks about, I support that, certainly for commercial industrial. For residential, it might get people in Texas pretty upset, but it's perhaps a lot better than what Ross had to put up with.
Okay. Thank you so very much again. The hour is up, so I can't impose upon your time any longer. A special thanks to all the panelists for allowing your time. Very, very much thank you to all the attendees. I hope it had been helpful. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Golbon.
Golbon, thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
My great pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.